Kyle kept his hand steady as he filled out the assessment form. The stylus moved across the tablet with mechanical precision, each checkmark a small act of control in a job that demanded nothing else. Around him, the quarantine station hummed with filtered air and muted voices, species he had learned to read through gestures instead of scent, through the tilt of a head or the tension in borrowed postures. He had been doing this for 11 months. Before the blight, he had studied soil compositions on the third moon of Helion 7, measuring nitrogen levels and root development in hydroponic bays. The work had been solitary, predictable. He had preferred it that way. Now he sat in sterile observation rooms and decided whether families could reunite, whether contracts held legal weight, whether someone's grief was genuine or performed. The Corthus delegate across from him shifted in her seat, her carapace clicking softly against the reinforced chair. She was asking him to verify her fitness for diplomatic service after recovering from a suspected blight exposure. Her compound eyes tracked his movements with an intensity that felt invasive, searching for the judgment her own people could no longer provide. Kyle watched the way her mandibles twitched when she spoke about her recovery, watched how her secondary limbs remained too still, held close to her thorax in a posture that suggested conscious suppression rather than natural rest. He noted the slight delay between her verbal responses and the micro-adjustments of her posture, as if she were translating internal states into external performance, instead of allowing them to flow unconsciously. "You're clear," he said. No signs of residual impairment. The delegate's entire body seemed to deflate with relief. She thanked him in 3 languages, her voice modulated with a gratitude he found difficult to accept. He had only observed. He had done nothing to earn this kind of response. But that was the work now, being certain when no one else could be. He finished the day's assessments and returned to his quarters, a small compartment with a sleep platform, a storage unit, and a narrow window that faced the station's docking ring. Ships came and went in slow rotations, their hulls marked with quarantine seals and verification codes. Everything moved through checkpoints now. Everything required proof. Kyle sat on the edge of the platform and removed his boots. His feet ached. His shoulders carried a tension that never fully released, even in sleep. He had stopped dreaming about soil samples months ago. Now he dreamed about faces he could not read, about being asked questions he could not answer, about the moment when his certainty would fail and someone would suffer for it. He ate a ration bar without tasting it, then lay down and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion pulled him under. The message arrived during his second shift rotation, a priority code from the Administrative Council requesting his immediate presence in the executive wing. Kyle read it twice, then checked the sender authentication. Legitimate. Unusual, but legitimate. He had never been summoned to the executive wing before. His work was procedural, low clearance, conducted in standard observation chambers with minimal oversight. He processed refugees, merchants, station workers, people whose status needed verification before they could move through bureaucratic channels. He was not involved in political matters. The executive wing occupied the station's upper decks, where atmospheric controls maintained species-specific environments and security protocols filtered every entry. Kyle passed through 3 checkpoints, each requiring biometric confirmation and purpose declaration. The guards, a mix of species he recognized by uniform rather than biology, scanned him with devices that measured more than just identity. A Vethrani attendant met him at the final gate. She moved with the fluid grace her species was known for, her forearms gesturing in patterns that might have once carried scent-encoded meaning. Now they were simply movement, aesthetically deliberate but functionally empty. "Lady Scythar is expecting you," the attendant said, her voice modulated through a translator that smoothed out the clicking harmonics of her natural speech. Kyle followed her through corridors lined with ambient light panels that shifted in response to proximity. The air here smelled different, filtered through systems that accommodated Vethrani biology, carrying a faint metallic sweetness he associated with their respiratory chemistry. The attendant stopped at a doorway that irised open silently. Beyond it, a private chamber furnished with low platforms and curved surfaces designed for segmented bodies. And in the center, illuminated by amber light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, sat Lady Scythar. Kyle had seen Vethrani officials before, but never one of her rank. Her exoskeleton, bore the deep blue-black coloration of high caste lineage, and the geometric patterns etched into her carapace suggested 6 generations of political authority. Her 4 arms were arranged in a posture of formal greeting, but her primary eyes remained fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her translator rendered her voice as low and measured, almost intimate in its quiet precision. Kyle stood just inside the doorway, uncertain of the protocol. "I received your summons." "Not a summons," Sithar corrected gently. "A request. There is a difference, though I understand the distinction may seem academic from your position." She gestured with one of her smaller hands toward a seat designed for bipedal physiology. Kale sat, aware of the way his human frame contrasted with the room's architecture, his presence a biological anomaly in a space built for bodies that communicated through chemistry. "I need your expertise," Scyther continued. "But more than that, I need your discretion. What I'm about to share with you cannot leave this room." Kale nodded. He had signed confidentiality agreements for every assessment he conducted. Privacy was foundational to his work. Scythar's secondary arms unfolded slightly, a gesture he had learned to associate with uncertainty or internal conflict. "My niece, Virith, is being considered as my successor. The Succession Council requires verification of her fitness, both medical and psychological. Since the Blight, such verification has become complicated. You want me to assess her?" "Yes, but not in a clinical setting. She cannot know she is being evaluated. The moment she becomes aware of observation, her behavior will change. I need to see who she is when she believes she is unobserved." Kyle felt something tighten in his chest. That would require extended proximity, time spent in her presence without her knowing the purpose. "Yes," Scythar's gaze did not waver. "I am asking you to join my household staff. Officially, you would serve as a cultural liaison, someone who can help navigate interactions with human delegations. Unofficially, you would observe Virith during family gatherings, council meetings, private moments. You would tell me what you see." The request settled over him like a weight. This was not standard verification work. This was surveillance disguised as service. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. Sithar's posture shifted subtly, her primary arms folding inward in what might have been disappointment or resignation. "Then I will find another human willing to accept the position. But I requested you specifically, because your record shows consistency, precision, and an absence of bias. I need someone who will tell me the truth, even when the truth is difficult." Kyle looked down at his hands, at the calluses still visible from years of working with soil and root systems. He thought about returning to his small quarters, to the endless rotation of assessments and check marks, to the certainty that never felt like enough. "I'll need access to her medical history," he said finally, "and baseline behavioral data from before the Blight, if any exists." Sithar's entire body seemed to relax. "You'll have everything you require." Kyle moved into the Sithar estate 3 days later. The compound occupied an entire residential sector, a series of interconnected structures that blended Vethrani architectural principles with the station's modular design. The air here was warmer than standard human comfortable temperatures, maintained at levels that suited Vethrani metabolism. He was assigned quarters in a wing designated for non-family staff, a room larger than his previous compartment, with furniture that had been hastily adapted for human physiology. A sleep platform, a workspace, a small hygiene station. The window overlooked an interior courtyard, where bioluminescent plants grown in hydroponic beds cast soft green light across sculptured pathways. The household staff were mostly Korthus and Selim, species whose own pheromonal systems had been disrupted by the Blight, but who could still function in service roles through learned protocols and mechanical cues. They showed him the routines, meal preparation schedules, atmospheric adjustment protocols, the formal gestures used to request entry or signal departure. Kyle learned quickly. He had always been good at observing systems, at identifying patterns, and adapting to established structures. Within a week, he moved through the estate with practiced efficiency, his presence accepted if not fully understood. Virith arrived on the 8th day. Kyle was in the courtyard reviewing data files on his tablet when he heard the distinctive clicking rhythm of Vethrani movement approaching. He looked up and saw her for the first time outside of archival images. She was younger than Scythar, her exoskeleton still carrying the lighter pigmentation of early adulthood. Her movements were precise, controlled, but there was something in the way she held her secondary arms, tucked close to her torso, almost protective, that suggested discomfort with her own body. She noticed him watching and stopped. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, human and Vethrani, separated by biology and purpose. "You're the new liaison," she said. Her translator carried a warmer tone than Scythar's, less formal, more curious. "Kyle," he confirmed. "I'm Vireth." She gestured with one of her primary hands toward the tablet he held. "What are you reading?" "Cultural briefings. Your aunt wants me prepared for potential human delegations." Vireth's ocular membranes flickered, a Vethrani expression he had not yet learned to interpret. "My aunt wants many things. Most of them involve me becoming someone I'm not." The statement carried an edge of bitterness that made Kyle pause. He had been told to observe, not to engage. But she was speaking to him directly, offering information without prompting. "Succession is difficult," he said carefully. "Succession is a performance," Vireth corrected. "And I've never been good at performing." She moved past him toward the estate's main entrance, her secondary arms still held close, her posture suggesting someone carrying weight they had not chosen. Kyle watched her go and made mental notes. The tension in her shoulder joints, the slight asymmetry in her gait, the way she had spoken about performance as if it were separate from identity. He opened a new file on his tablet and began documenting what he had seen. The days settled into patterns. Kyle attended family dinners in the estate's formal hall, seated at a smaller table designated for staff, but positioned where he could observe the primary gathering. He watched Vireth navigate conversations with relatives whose names and titles he was still learning, noting how she deferred to older family members, how her responses often came fractionally too late, as if she were calculating appropriate reactions rather than expressing instinctive ones. He accompanied Scythar to council meetings held in sealed chambers, where political discussions unfolded through spoken language alone, stripped of the chemical certainty that had once underscored every negotiation. He sat in designated observation positions and catalogued the micro-expressions of delegates, whose species he had studied in clinical contexts, but never in political ones. And in the evenings, when the household quieted and most of the staff withdrew to their quarters, he compiled his observations into detailed reports that he delivered to Scythar in private sessions that lasted longer than they needed to. She would sit across from him, her primary eyes fixed on his face with that same searching intensity, and ask him what he had seen. He would tell her Vireth's hesitation when asked about policy matters, the way her breathing changed when succession was mentioned, the protective posture of her secondary arms that never fully relaxed even in supposedly comfortable settings. "Is she afraid?" Scythar asked during one of these sessions. "Yes," Kyle said. "Of what?" "Of failing, of being inadequate, of becoming you." Scythar's entire body went still. The ambient light caught the edges of her carapace, highlighting the geometric patterns that marked her lineage. "She told you this?" "She doesn't have to. It's visible in everything she does." Scythar exhaled slowly, that sound like wind through reeds. She was silent for a long moment, her smaller hands resting on the surface between them. Then she looked at him with something that might have been grief or recognition. "Do you know what it's like," she said quietly, "to lose the ability to trust your own perceptions? To know that everyone around you could be lying, and you would never know, because the part of you that detects deception simply stopped working." Kyle thought about soil samples and nitrogen levels, about work that had required precision but never trust. "No. It's like being erased," Scythar continued. "Not dead, just absent. And the only way to feel present again is to have someone else tell you what is real." She reached across the space between them and placed one of her smaller hands on his forearm. The contact was deliberate, testing, just as it had been the first time. Her exoskeleton was warm, smooth, and he could feel the faint vibration of her internal musculature adjusting to the proximity of his skin. "You make me feel present," she said. Kyle did not pull away. He sat very still, aware of the heat of her touch, of the way his own pulse had accelerated slightly, of the boundary they were approaching without acknowledgement. "I should finish the report," he said finally. Scythar withdrew her hand slowly, her gaze lingering on his face for another moment before she nodded. "So of course." But as Cale returned to his quarters that night, he could still feel the warmth of her touch on his skin, and he knew that something had shifted in a way he could not document or quantify. 3 weeks into his residence at the estate, Vireth began seeking him out. Not formally. She never requested his presence or scheduled meetings, but she would appear in spaces where he happened to be, in the courtyard or the library archive, or the observation deck that overlooked the station's main concourse. She would ask him questions about human culture, about Earth before the Blight, about what it was like to communicate without pheromones. Her curiosity felt genuine, unperformed, and Kyle found himself answering with more honesty than he intended. "Do you miss it?" she asked one evening as they stood on the observation deck, watching ships drift past in slow rotation. "Your home world?" "I was born on a colony station," Kyle said. "I've never been to Earth. But you must have some connection to it, some sense of origin." "Not really. Humans adapt to wherever they are. We don't need chemical anchors to know where we belong." Vireth's ocular membranes flickered. "That sounds lonely." "Maybe. Or maybe it's freedom." She was quiet for a moment, her secondary arm still held close to her torso in that protective posture he had come to recognize. "I envy that," she said finally. "The ability to choose where you belong, instead of having it determined by biology." "You can choose," Kyle said. "Can I?" Vireth turned to face him fully, her primary eyes searching his face with an intensity that reminded him of Sci-Fi. "Everything about my life has been predetermined. My lineage, my education, my expected role. Even my emotions were supposed to be legible to everyone around me through scent. I was never taught how to choose because choice was never necessary. And now? Now I'm supposed to lead a family that can't trust me, and a political structure that doesn't know how to function without chemical certainty. And the only person who can verify whether I'm fit for this role is you." The statement hung between them like an accusation. Cale felt something cold settle in his chest. "You know." "Of course I know." Vireth's voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "My aunt doesn't summon human cultural liaisons. She summons observers. I've been performing for you since the day I arrived." Kyle wanted to deny it, but the truth sat too heavily between them. "I'm sorry. Don't be. I understand why she needs this." "I just wish—" Vireth trailed off, her gaze returning to the window, to the ships and the distant stars beyond. "I wish I could tell you who I actually am instead of who I'm supposed to be." "You can," Kyle said quietly. Vireth looked at him again, and for the first time he saw something unguarded in her expression, vulnerability that had not been calculated or performed. "Would you tell her if I showed you who I really am?" The question cut deeper than it should have. Cale thought about his reports, about the detailed observations he compiled every evening, about the trust Sithar had placed in him to provide truth regardless of consequence. "I don't know," he admitted. Vireth nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she had expected. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the observation deck with the weight of his own uncertainty. Kyle stopped writing detailed reports. He still attended family dinners and council meetings, still sat in observation positions and catalogued behavioral cues, but when he met with Sithar in the evenings, he found himself offering summaries instead of specifics, conclusions without evidence. "Vireth is managing the pressure well," he would say. "Tolakisam, I haven't observed any concerning patterns." Sithar accepted these assessments without question, but Kyle could see the way her posture changed when he spoke, a subtle tension in her primary arms, a flickering of her ocular membranes that suggested doubt or dissatisfaction. One evening she asked him directly, "What aren't you telling me?" Kyle sat across from her in the private chamber that had become too familiar, the amber light casting shadows across her carapace. "Nothing that would change your assessment of her fitness." "That's not what I asked." He met her gaze and saw the same searching intensity, the same need for certainty that had defined every interaction they'd had. But beneath it, he saw something else, fear that what he might say could destroy something she valued more than political succession. "She's afraid," Kyle said carefully, "but fear doesn't make her unfit. It makes her careful, thoughtful. She questions herself, which means she won't make decisions lightly." Sithar was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, She extended one of her smaller hands across the space between them. Not to touch him, not yet, but to rest on the surface near his own hand, close enough that the heat of her exoskeleton radiated against his skin. "I'm afraid too," she said quietly. "Every day I wake up, and I don't know if the people around me are being honest, or if they're simply performing honesty in ways I can no longer detect. I don't know if my advisors respect me or pity me. I don't know if my family loves me, or if they're waiting for me to fail so they can replace me with someone whose pheromones still work." Her hand moved closer, not quite touching his, but near enough that he could feel the faint vibration of her internal musculature, the warmth that pulsed with her respiratory rhythm. "But when you're here," she continued, "I know what is real. You see things I can't see anymore. You tell me truths I can't access on my own. And that makes you the most important person in my life right now, whether you want to be or not." Kyle looked down at their hands, his and hers, human and Vethrani, separated by millimeters and by biology that should have made connection impossible. He thought about the reports he wasn't writing, about Vireth's unguarded vulnerability, about the way Sithar's need for certainty had become indistinguishable from something deeper. He moved his hand slightly, closing the distance. The contact was light, deliberate, testing. Her exoskeleton was smooth and warm beneath his palm, and he felt the subtle shift of her musculature responding to the unfamiliar intimacy. Sithar did not pull away. She held very still, her gaze fixed on their joined hands, her breathing slow and measured. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor he had never heard before. "Thank you." They sat like that for several minutes, neither speaking, the silence filled only with the ambient hum of the estate's environmental systems and the quiet rhythm of their separate biologies finding unexpected synchronization. When Kyle finally withdrew his hand and returned to his quarters, he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and feeling the phantom warmth of her touch still present on his skin. The Succession Council convened in a sealed chamber, deep within the administrative complex. Kyle was required to attend as Sithar's designated observer, seated in a peripheral position where he could watch the proceedings without participating directly. The council consisted of 12 Vethrani representatives from allied families, each one carrying the weight of centuries-old lineages and political alliances that predated human contact with the galaxy. They moved through formal protocols with practiced precision, their gestures deliberate but emotionally opaque, in ways that must have once been rich with pheromonal meaning. Vireth stood at the center of the chamber, her posture formally rigid, her secondary arms held in the traditional position of supplication. The council questioned her about policy positions, about resource allocation strategies, about her understanding of diplomatic protocols that no longer functioned as they once had. She answered each question carefully, her responses measured and precise. But Kyle could see the tension in her shoulder joints, the slight tremor in her smallest hands, the way her breathing became shallow when certain topics arose. She was performing competence while barely managing the fear that threatened to destabilize her. One of the council members, an elderly Vethrani whose carapace bore the deep scarring of age and authority, leaned forward slightly. "Tell us, Vireth, how you would approach negotiations with human delegations, given their biological absence from our traditional communication frameworks." Vireth's ocular membranes flickered. She glanced briefly toward where Kale sat, then returned her focus to the council. "I would prioritize transparency in verbal communication and establish clear behavioral protocols that don't rely on chemical verification. Humans have proven capable of navigating complex social structures without pheromonal interfaces. We should learn from their adaptations rather than treating their biology as a deficit." The response was diplomatic, carefully neutral. But Kyle heard something beneath it, a genuine respect for human adaptability that suggested more than political calculation. The council continued questioning her for another hour. By the end, Vireth's entire body trembled with exhaustion, her posture barely maintained through what looked like sheer will. When the council finally dismissed her, she left the chamber without meeting anyone's gaze. Kale found her later in the courtyard, sitting on one of the sculpted benches beneath the bioluminescent plants. She was alone, her secondary arms unfolded now, her posture collapsed into something that looked like defeat. He approached slowly, uncertain if his presence would be welcome. "You did well in there." Vireth didn't look at him. "I lied in there. About what? About everything. About believing I could lead. About wanting this role. About respecting traditions I don't understand anymore. She finally turned to face him, and he saw exhaustion in her expression that went deeper than physical tiredness. I've been performing my entire life, Kyle, and I don't know how to stop. He sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to offer presence without words. They sat in silence for several minutes, the green light from the plants casting shifting patterns across their bodies. "What would you do," Vireth asked quietly, "if you didn't have to perform anymore?" Kale thought about soil samples and nitrogen levels, about work that had felt meaningful before he understood how much meaning could exist in simply being present for another person. "I don't know, I've been performing too in my own way. As my aunt's observer." "Yes. Do you tell her everything you see?" "No." Vireth absorbed this quietly. Then slowly she extended one of her smaller hands toward him, not touching but resting near his on the bench between them, an echo of the gesture Scyther had made. "Thank you," she said. Kale understood that the gratitude was not for his observations or his discretion, but for the simple act of sitting beside her without judgment or expectation. He moved his hand slightly, closing the distance, and felt the warmth of her exoskeleton against his palm. They sat like that until the courtyard lights dimmed to simulate night, two beings separated by biology, but connected by the shared weight of roles they had not chosen and could not escape. Sithar summoned him to her private chambers late that night. Kyle arrived to find her pacing, a behavior he had never witnessed before, her forearms moving in agitated patterns that suggested deep distress. "The council is divided," she said without preamble. "Half believe Vireth is fit for succession. Half suspect she's infected with the blight and is simply hiding the symptoms well enough to pass your observations." Kyle felt something cold settle in his stomach. "She's not infected." "You're certain?" "Yes." "Then why do they doubt her?" Scythar stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. "What are they seeing that you're not telling me?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Kyle thought about Vireth's trembling exhaustion in the council chamber, about her admission of constant performance, about the way she collapsed when she thought no one was watching. "They're seeing someone who doesn't trust herself," he said carefully. "Someone who questions every decision because she's afraid of making mistakes. That looks like doubt, and doubt looks like impairment." "Is she impaired?" "No, she's human." Sithar's posture went rigid. "She's Vethrani. She's living in a world where chemical certainty doesn't exist anymore. She's learning to navigate doubt the way humans do, by accepting that she might be wrong and choosing anyway. That's not impairment. That's adaptation." Scyther was silent for a long moment. Then she moved closer to him, her primary eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt almost desperate. "You're protecting her. I'm telling you the truth." "Are you?" She reached out with both of her smaller hands, cupping his face with a gentleness that belied the strength in her segmented limbs. "Or are you telling me what you think I need to hear?" Kyle felt the warmth of her touch spreading across his skin, felt the subtle vibration of her musculature adjusting to the contours of his human features. He could smell the faint metallic sweetness of her respiratory chemistry, could hear the soft clicking of her internal anatomy working beneath the smooth surface of her exoskeleton. "I don't know," he admitted. Sithar's grip tightened slightly, not painful but insistent, holding him in place so he could not look away from her gaze. "I need you to know. I need you to be certain. Because if you're wrong about her, if she fails, then everything I've built, everything my family has built across 6 generations, will collapse. And I cannot bear that weight without knowing that someone I trust has told me the truth." Her hands trembled against his face. He realized with sudden clarity that she was crying, not in any way he could see, but in the tension of her body, in the shallow rasp of her breathing, in the way she held onto him as if he were the only solid thing in a universe that had become fundamentally unreliable. Kyle reached up slowly and placed his hands over hers, human fingers wrapping around Vethrani exoskeleton in a gesture of reassurance that transcended biology. "Vireth is afraid," he said quietly. "But fear doesn't make her weak, it makes her careful. And careful leaders don't destroy legacies, they preserve them by refusing to make reckless choices." Scythar exhaled slowly, her entire body seeming to deflate with the release of held tension. She lowered her hands from his face but did not pull away completely, her smaller hands now resting against his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat through the fabric of his clothing. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly. "Not as my observer, just as someone who makes me feel less alone." Kyle knew he should refuse, knew that crossing this boundary would complicate everything: his role, his objectivity, his ability to navigate the impossible position he had accepted. But he also knew that refusing would be a cruelty he could not justify. "All right," he said. They moved to the low platform that served as her resting place, designed for a Vethrani body, but large enough to accommodate his presence beside her. She arranged herself in a posture that allowed her primary arms to fold across her torso, while her smaller hands remained in contact with him, one resting against his shoulder, the other against his side, maintaining connection without confinement. Kale lay beside her, acutely aware of the heat radiating from her exoskeleton, of the subtle vibrations of her internal systems that created a rhythm almost like a second heartbeat. He did not sleep, but neither did she, and in the quiet hours before dawn, they simply existed together in a silence that felt more honest than any conversation they had ever had. Virith stopped attending family gatherings. She submitted formal reports to the Succession Council, but declined to participate in person, citing the need to focus on administrative preparation. The absence was noted, discussed, interpreted as evidence of either wisdom or weakness depending on which council faction one belonged to. Sithar became increasingly withdrawn. She conducted her political duties with practiced efficiency, but retreated to her private chambers immediately afterward, often summoning Kale to sit with her in silence that stretched for hours. Sometimes she would ask him questions about human culture or Earth's history before the Blight. Sometimes she would simply rest one of her hands against his and say nothing at all. The household staff noticed the changes, but said nothing. Protocols were maintained, routines continued, but there was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with atmospheric composition and everything to do with the weight of decisions being delayed. Kyle found himself caught between three positions: Scythar's need for certainty, Vireth's need for understanding, and his own need to maintain the boundaries that professional observation required. He had failed at all three. He sought out Vireth in the library archive one evening, finding her surrounded by data tablets displaying historical succession records. She looked up when he entered, her ocular membranes flickering in what might have been surprise or resignation. "I've been reviewing every succession in our family's history," she said without greeting. "Do you know what I've discovered?" Kyle shook his head. Every single one was verified through pheromonal assessment. Council members could smell competence, could detect deception, could verify emotional stability through biological certainty. There's no precedent for what I'm being asked to prove my fitness through observation alone, through the interpretation of gestures and micro-expressions by someone who isn't even part of my species. She paused, her gaze fixing on his with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm not being evaluated as a leader. I'm being evaluated as a performance of leadership. And I don't know how to pass that test." "Maybe you're not supposed to pass it," Kyle said quietly. "Maybe you're supposed to change what the test measures. By failing. By being honest about what leadership requires in a world where chemical certainty doesn't exist anymore. By showing them that doubt isn't weakness. It's the only rational response to a universe that no longer provides biological answers to existential questions." Virith was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and moved closer to him, her secondary arms unfolding from their protective position for the first time since he had known her. "You don't believe I should lead, do you? I believe you're the only one asking the right questions." She reached out with one of her smaller hands and touched his face, a gesture so similar to Sithar's that it made his chest tighten. But where Sithar's touch had been desperate, searching for certainty, Vireth's was gentle, almost exploratory. "My aunt trusts you," she said softly. "She's in love with you, even if she doesn't have the language to name it that way. And you're protecting me from her because you think it's the right thing to do. But all you're doing is delaying the inevitable." Kyle felt the warmth of her touch against his skin, felt the familiar vibration of Vethrani musculature adjusting to human anatomy. What's inevitable? The moment when you have to choose between her need for certainty and my need for truth, between maintaining the system that gives her power and supporting the change that would allow me to be myself. Vireth lowered her hand slowly. And whichever choice you make, someone will be hurt. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone in the archive surrounded by the weight of historical precedents that no longer applied to a galaxy that had fundamentally changed. The Succession Council issued its formal decision 3 weeks later. Vireth's fitness remained unverified, pending additional observation and assessment. The statement was carefully worded, politically neutral, but its meaning was clear. The Council did not trust her, and by extension, they did not trust Kyle's verification. Sci-Fi received the notification in her private chambers with Kyle present. She read it once, then set the tablet aside with movements so controlled they suggested violence barely contained. "They're questioning your judgment," she said quietly. "They're questioning yours," Kyle corrected, "for relying on human observation when Vethrani tradition demands chemical certainty. Chemical certainty doesn't exist anymore." Sithar's voice carried an edge of fury he had never heard before. "The Blight took that from us. It took everything that made our communication reliable, our hierarchies stable, our societies functional. And instead of accepting that loss and adapting, they're clinging to traditions that can never be restored." She stood abruptly and began pacing, her 4 arms moving in agitated patterns. "I brought you into my household because I believed you could provide the truth I could no longer access on my own. I trusted you. I gave you access to my family, my political councils, my private spaces. I let you see me in ways no one outside my species should ever see. And now they're telling me that your observations don't matter because you don't have pheromonal glands." Kyle watched her pace, saw the tension radiating through her entire body, and felt something inside himself crack. "I can't give you what you need." Sithar stopped moving. She turned to face him, her primary eyes wide, her posture frozen in something that might have been shock or recognition. "I can observe behavior," Kyle continued, his voice low and steady despite the tremor he felt spreading through his chest. "I can catalog micro-expressions and postural cues and breathing patterns. I can tell you what I see. But I can't give you certainty. I can't replace what the Blight took from you, and I shouldn't have pretended I could." "You didn't pretend," Sithar said quietly. "I asked you to be something you couldn't be, and you tried anyway because I needed it." She moved closer to him, her smaller hands reaching out to frame his face the way they had before. Gentle, testing, desperate. "I'm sorry." Kale covered her hands with his own, feeling the warmth of her exoskeleton, the trembling in her limbs. Vireth doesn't need verification. She needs permission to be uncertain, to lead without chemical proof, to make mistakes and learn from them. If the Council can't accept that, then they're not ready for the galaxy we're living in now. And if I force them to accept her anyway? If I use my authority to override their concerns and designate her as my successor without their full support? Then you'll be doing what leaders have always done, making a choice despite uncertainty and accepting the consequences. Sithar's hands trembled against his face. He could feel the heat of her body, could smell the metallic sweetness of her respiration, could sense the way her entire being was oriented toward him in a moment of vulnerability that transcended biology. "I can't lose you," she whispered. Kyle understood what she was really saying, that he had become more than an observer, more than a source of verification. He had become the anchor that allowed her to function in a world where her own perceptions could not be trusted. And if he left, she would be adrift in uncertainty with no way to distinguish truth from deception. He leaned forward slowly and pressed his forehead against the smooth curve of her carapace, a gesture of intimacy that had no precedent in either of their species' traditions, but felt right in the space they had created between them. "You won't lose me," he said, "but you have to let me stop being your certainty. You have to learn to trust yourself again." They stayed like that for a long time, Human and Vethrani, holding each other in the amber light of her private chambers, while the weight of impossible choices pressed down on them both. The formal succession ritual was scheduled for the new moon cycle, a traditional timing that carried symbolic weight, even though the pheromonal components that had once made it sacred no longer functioned. Sci-Fi announced her decision to the Council. Vireth would be designated as successor pending completion of the ritual, and Kale would serve as witness in accordance with the new protocols that accommodated post-Blight reality. The council accepted the decision with formal acknowledgement and private resistance. Kale heard the whispered conversations in corridors, saw the way certain council members avoided eye contact, noticed the subtle shifts in household routines that suggested preparation for something other than celebration. Virith began the traditional pre-succession isolation, 7 days spent in meditative preparation without contact from family or advisors. Kale was exempt from this restriction in his role as witness, but he chose to respect the boundary anyway, understanding that she needed the space to reconcile herself with the role being forced upon her. Sci-Fi became increasingly tense as the ritual date approached. She conducted her duties with mechanical precision, but withdrew from personal interaction, even with Kyle. He found her late one night standing at the observation window in her chambers, staring out at the ships moving in slow rotation around the station. "The ritual requires physical contact," she said, without turning to face him. Traditional succession involved the transfer of pheromonal markers from the current leader to the designated successor, a biological passing of authority that everyone present could verify through scent. "Since that's no longer possible, we've adapted the protocol. I'll place my hands on Vireth's shoulders, and you'll observe to confirm that the gesture is genuine, that neither of us is being coerced or performing under duress." She finally turned to look at him. "It's a performance, a symbolic replacement for something that used to have biological weight, and everyone will know it's just performance. But they'll accept it anyway because the alternative is admitting that succession itself has become meaningless." Kyle moved to stand beside her at the window. "It's not meaningless. It's just different." "Is it?" Sithar's voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "Or are we just pretending that rituals still matter when the foundations they were built on have been erased?" He thought about soil samples and nitrogen levels, about measuring systems that had felt meaningful because they provided quantifiable results. About how meaning existed, not in the measurements themselves, but in what those measurements allowed him to do, to help things grow, to prevent disease, to create environments where life could flourish. "Meaning isn't in the ritual," he said quietly. "It's in what the ritual represents. You're choosing to trust Vireth with your family's legacy. That choice has weight regardless of whether it's verified chemically or observed behaviorally. The council will accept it because you've given them no alternative that doesn't require them to admit their entire system has failed." Scythar reached out and took his hand, not seeking verification this time, just contact, connection, the presence of another living being in a moment of profound uncertainty. Her exoskeleton was warm against his palm, and he could feel her pulse through the subtle movements of her internal systems. "Will you stay?" she asked. "After the ritual?" "After Vireth takes over, and I'm no longer required to make these impossible choices." Kale thought about what staying would mean, continuing to serve as a bridge between human biology and Vethrani need, maintaining the intimacy they had developed while knowing it was built on dependency rather than choice. He thought about leaving, returning to assessment work in sterile quarantine facilities, moving through the galaxy as a functionally useful tool with no deeper connections. "I don't know," he admitted. Scythar nodded slowly, accepting the uncertainty with a grace he had not seen her demonstrate before. "That's honest. Thank you." They stood together at the window, watching ships come and go, holding hands in silence while the ritual date approached with inevitable momentum. Virith emerged from isolation on the 7th day, looking transformed. Not physically. Her exoskeleton was the same. Her posture still carried traces of the protective tension Kyle had learned to recognize, but there was something in the way she held herself that suggested resolution rather than resignation. The ritual was scheduled for evening, timed to coincide with the station's simulated sunset, when ambient light shifted to warmer tones that Vethrani biology found calming. The ceremony hall was prepared according to traditional specifications: circular arrangement of platforms for family and council members, central raised dais where the succession would be formalized, atmospheric controls calibrated to maintain optimal pheromonal diffusion, even though no meaningful pheromones would be exchanged. Kale was positioned at the periphery where he could observe without participating, his role clearly defined as witness rather than celebrant. He watched as family members filed in, as council members took their designated positions, as the ambient light shifted through its programmed sequence to signal the beginning of sacred time. Sci-Fi entered first, her exoskeleton polished to deep luster, the geometric patterns of her lineage highlighted with pigments that caught the light. She moved to the central dais with practiced grace, her forearms held in the formal position of authority that she had maintained throughout her leadership. Then Vireth entered, and the entire assembly went still. She wore no traditional ornamentation. Her exoskeleton was unpolished, natural, and her secondary arms were not folded in supplication, but held loosely at her sides in a posture that suggested openness rather than submission. She walked to the dais without the deliberate precision Kyle had observed in every other formal setting, moving instead with a natural rhythm that looked almost casual. When she reached Sci-Fi, she did not lower her head in the traditional gesture of deference. She met her aunt's gaze directly, her primary eyes steady and unblinking. The silence in the chamber stretched uncomfortably. Kale could see tension rippling through the assembled observers, could sense the breach of protocol being registered and evaluated. Then Vireth spoke, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic design. "I cannot lead as you have led. I cannot provide chemical certainty or biological proof of my intentions. I cannot smell truth or detect deception through pheromonal markers. But I can offer something our traditions never required before. The acknowledgement that leadership in this new galaxy requires the courage to act without certainty, to make choices knowing they might be wrong, and to accept that trust must be built through actions rather than verified through biology." She extended her smaller hands toward Sithar, not in supplication, but in invitation. "If you transfer authority to me, you're not just choosing a successor. You're choosing to let our family evolve beyond the traditions that no longer serve us. And I need you to make that choice consciously, not because protocol demands it." The chamber remained silent. Kyle watched Scythar's posture shift through micro-adjustments that spoke of internal struggle. The tension between maintaining tradition and accepting transformation, between preserving legacy and allowing evolution. Then Sithar placed her hands on Vireth's shoulders, the ritual gesture that symbolized transfer of authority. And when she spoke, her voice carried throughout the chamber with quiet force. "I choose evolution." The assembly erupted in responses that ranged from formal acknowledgement to barely concealed dissent. But the ritual was complete. Authority had been transferred, witnessed, verified through observation, if not through chemistry. Kyle felt something release in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the moment he accepted this impossible position. He had not provided certainty. He had simply been present while two people made choices that no biological system could verify or validate. As the ceremony concluded and the assembly began to disperse, Scythar caught his gaze across the crowded chamber. She did not smile. Vethrani facial structure did not accommodate that human expression, but something in her posture softened, and he understood that she was thanking him not for his observations, but for witnessing her transformation from someone who needed certainty to someone who could choose without it. The household reorganized itself around Vireth's leadership with the slow, uncertain adjustment of systems adapting to new parameters. Some council members resigned their positions immediately, unwilling to serve under a successor they considered unverified. Others remained, but maintained careful distance, observing rather than engaging. Vireth established new protocols that acknowledged post-blight reality. Meetings conducted with explicit verbal confirmation rather than chemical verification. Decisions documented through written record rather than pheromonal witness. Conflicts resolved through mediated discussion rather than scent-mediated dominance. It was clumsy, inefficient, and thoroughly unprecedented. It also worked. Scythar stepped back from active leadership, but maintained advisory status, serving as a bridge between traditional expectations and evolutionary necessity. She no longer summoned Kale for verification sessions. Instead, she would find him in the courtyard or the library archive and simply sit with him, sometimes talking about political developments, sometimes asking about human cultural practices, sometimes saying nothing at all. 3 months after the succession ritual, she asked him to walk with her through the residential sectors. They moved through corridors filled with species adapting to their own post-blight transformations. Korthas developing verbal negotiation techniques, Salim creating visual art to express emotions that had once been chemically communicated, humans serving as bridges in ways that went far beyond their original biological silence. "I've been offered a position," Sithar said as they walked. "The Galactic Medical Consortium wants me to lead a cross-species research initiative focused on developing new verification protocols for post-blight societies. They think my experience navigating political transition without pheromonal certainty makes me qualified. Are you going to accept?" "I don't know." She was quiet for a moment, her secondary arms moving in patterns that suggested internal deliberation. "It would mean leaving the estate, leaving Vireth to establish her leadership without my presence potentially undermining her authority. It would mean working with species I've never encountered, in contexts where my traditional training would be irrelevant. It would mean choosing growth over comfort," Kyle said quietly. Sithar stopped walking and turned to face him. They were in a section of corridor with windows overlooking the station's docking ring, ships moving in slow rotation against the backdrop of distant stars. "Would you come with me?" she asked. "Not as my observer, not as my source of verification, just as someone who understands what it's like to navigate a galaxy that fundamentally changed while we were trying to figure out how to live in it." Kale thought about soil samples and nitrogen levels, about work that had felt meaningful, before he understood how much more meaning could exist in simple presence. He thought about Vireth establishing her own path, about the succession ritual that had marked transformation rather than tradition, about the way Sithar no longer needed him to tell her what was real. "Yes," he said. Sithar reached out with both of her smaller hands, cupping his face in a gesture that had become familiar over months of shared vulnerability. But this time there was no desperation in her touch, no searching for certainty, only gratitude and something that might have been affection, or might have been the beginning of trust that didn't require biological verification. "Thank you," she said. They stood together in the corridor, human and Vethrani, watching ships drift past while making plans for futures neither of them could verify, but both were willing to choose anyway. Kale spent his final week at the estate, organizing his observations into comprehensive archives that Vireth could reference as needed. Not verification reports, those had lost their relevance, but cultural notes, behavioral patterns, insights into cross-species communication that might help her navigate the political complexities ahead. Vireth found him in the library archive on his last evening, her posture more relaxed than he had ever seen it, her secondary arms held loosely rather than protectively. "You're really going," she said. "Yes." "With my aunt?" "Yes." Vireth moved closer, her ocular membranes flickering in what he had learned to recognize as amusement. "She loves you, in whatever way Vethrani can love beings whose biology is completely incompatible with our traditional bonding mechanisms. Which is to say, she trusts you enough to be uncertain with you." "Is that love?" Kyle asked. "I think it might be the only kind of love that matters now." Vireth paused, then extended one of her smaller hands toward him. "Thank you for not telling her all my weaknesses, for protecting me when you could have verified me into irrelevance." Kyle took her hand, felt the familiar warmth of Vethrani exoskeleton. "You didn't need protection. You needed permission to be yourself. Same thing in a galaxy that demands performance." She held his hand for a moment longer, then released it. "Take care of her. She's stronger than she thinks, but she's also been carrying weight longer than anyone should have to." "I will." Vireth left him to finish his archival work. When he was done, Kyle walked through the estate one final time, past the courtyard where bioluminescent plants still cast green light across sculpted pathways, through corridors where household staff had learned to communicate without chemical certainty, into the observation deck where he had first understood that Vireth knew she was being watched. Sithar met him at the docking bay, where a transport waited to carry them to the Medical Consortium's research station. She had shed her formal ornamentation, her exoskeleton plain and unadorned, her posture suggesting anticipation rather than authority. "Ready?" she asked. Kyle shouldered the small pack containing everything he owned that mattered: data tablets, a few changes of clothing, a soil sample from Helion 7 that he had kept for reasons he could not quite articulate. "Ready." They boarded the transport together. As it detached from the station and began its acceleration toward the jump coordinates, Kyle looked back at the estate complex growing smaller against the backdrop of the station's massive structure. He thought about Virith establishing leadership through honesty rather than certainty, about council members learning to trust verbal commitment instead of chemical proof, about a galaxy slowly adapting to biological changes that had seemed catastrophic but might ultimately prove transformative. Sci-Fi sat beside him, her smallest hand resting near his on the armrest between their seats. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that the intention was clear. They would navigate this new position together, learning what it meant to build connection without biological certainty, to create meaning in spaces where traditional verification no longer functioned. The transport completed its acceleration and entered the quiet physics of faster-than-light travel. Stars became streaks of light, distance collapsed into mathematical abstraction, and Cale felt the familiar sensation of transition, not from one place to another, but from who he had been to who he was becoming. He moved his hand slightly, closing the distance between them. Sci-Fi's exoskeleton was warm against his palm, and he felt the subtle vibration of her internal systems, not searching for certainty anymore, just existing in the presence of someone who had learned to see her without chemical proof and had chosen to stay anyway. "Where do we go from here?" Sci-Fi asked quietly. Kyle thought about the question, not as a request for navigation coordinates, but as an existential inquiry about futures that could not be verified or predicted. He thought about soil samples that became forests, about systems that evolved in response to catastrophic change, about the way meaning emerged not from certainty, but from the willingness to keep growing, despite uncertainty. "Forward," he said. "We go forward." And in the quiet hum of the transport carrying them toward unknown work and uncertain futures, that answer felt like enough.